The girl was born in a village where the earth was everything. Food came from it, homes were made of it, and lives depended on it. Yet despite its importance, people often forgot to respect it, just as they forgot to respect her. She grew up close to the soil, her hands always brown from planting seeds, her feet bare as she walked through fields and paths without complaint. Her clothes were simple, never adorned with ornaments or fine fabrics, but always neat, and there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. From childhood, she showed a kindness that drew some to her and repelled others, for her humility became a mirror in which envy and disdain were reflected. She would share her food, no matter how little, and would comfort even those who mocked her, her heart unshaken by cruelty. Her beauty was not the kind that shone like gold in the sun, but like the earth after rain, soft, rich, and alive with promise. Her dark eyes carried warmth, and her voice, though often quiet, had the power to soothe even a crying child or calm a restless animal. When elders spoke, she listened with patience. When children played, she joined them without pride. She never asked for recognition, never raised her voice, and never boasted of what she had done, though many depended on her silent labors. She tended her small garden with devotion, not for herself alone, but so that others could eat. She collected herbs for the sick and carried water for neighbors too frail to walk to the river. The soil seemed to love her back, for her plants always thrived, and her garden never withered. But humility often makes people targets. Some villagers, instead of admiring her strength, sneered at her simplicity. To them, she was nothing but a girl too poor to wear fine beads, too plain to sit among them during celebrations. They would laugh at her bare feet and the dirt that clung to her skin, not realizing it was the same earth that sustained them all. In her presence, their own insecurities grew heavier. They mocked the way she bent low to tend the soil, whispering that she belonged more to the ground than to people. And when they spoke in cruel jest, calling her the daughter of dirt, she would only smile faintly as if their words had no power over her. But behind that smile, a quiet strength grew, rooted as deeply as the trees that surrounded the village. She had no mother to defend her, no father to protect her, for both had passed when she was young. She lived alone in a small hut at the edge of the fields, where the soil stretched wide and endless. It was there she found her peace, listening to the songs of birds, the hum of insects, and the deep silence of the ground beneath her feet. While others saw her as lowly, she saw herself as part of something greater. The soil was her companion, her teacher, and her protector. She whispered to it when she planted seeds, thanking it for what it gave. She cried into it when her loneliness felt heavy, and somehow, the ground always seemed to absorb her sorrow, leaving her lighter afterward. The villagers, however, did not understand this bond. They measured worth in wealth, in possessions, in outward beauty, and so to them she was less. They gossiped about her, saying she was strange, that she preferred dirt to people, that she was destined for nothing. Even those who once received her kindness would sometimes turn against her when the crowd began to jeer, fearing that defending her would make them targets too. She was left to endure the mockery with quiet grace, bowing her head when others would have raised their fists. But every insult pressed her closer to the earth she loved, teaching her patience, teaching her endurance, teaching her how to root herself deeper instead of breaking. Children sometimes imitated the way adults mocked her, tossing small clumps of soil toward her when she passed, laughing as though it were a game. She never retaliated, never shouted, never cursed. Instead, she gathered the thrown earth gently in her hands and returned it to the ground, whispering words only the soil could hear. It was this strange calmness that unsettled some, for they could not understand how one so humiliated could still walk with such quiet dignity. And so the disdain grew sharper, their need to belittle her stronger, as if her silence was a kind of defiance. Yet beneath it all she remained pure, kind, and grounded. Her spirit was unshaken, even if her heart carried wounds. She lived each day as if the earth itself was her kin, and while others saw only dirt clinging to her, the soil saw something different, a daughter who belonged to it. And though she did not yet know it, that bond, the bond mocked by others, would one day rise with a force beyond imagination. For the soil does not forget those who love it, nor does it forgive those who mock its chosen. They gathered in the square, a crowd drawn not by celebration but by cruelty. The girl stood at the center, her head bowed, her body trembling though she tried to stand with dignity. She had done nothing to deserve such treatment. No crime, no betrayal, no sin. Yet envy and scorn had festered so long in the hearts of the villagers that they sought a spectacle, a way to turn their jeers into an act so cruel it would scar her forever. Someone had whispered that if she loved the dirt so much, she should be made to eat it, and the idea spread like fire on dry grass. What began as mockery became a punishment, not because she had wronged anyone, but because she had remained too kind, too pure, too patient in the face of their malice. The jeering began before the act itself. They called her names: child of dirt, earth eater, daughter of dust. The words struck her like stones, each one sharper than the last. Some laughed with wild delight, their mouths twisted with hatred disguised as humor. Others smirked quietly, relieved that they were not the ones being targeted, their silence feeding the cruelty. A few children, mimicking their elders, clapped their hands and shouted, dancing around her as though it were a festival. She tried to look past them, tried to fix her gaze on the horizon where the field stretched wide and silent, but the wall of bodies closed in around her, pressing her shame tighter. Then one of the men bent down and scooped a handful of soil from the ground. It was rough, full of grit and small stones, damp from the morning dew. He held it up to her face with a sneer. "If you love the earth so much," he jeered, "then take it into you. Let us see how sweet your dirt tastes." His laughter rang out, joined by others, until the whole square seemed to echo with a chorus of mockery. She shook her head faintly, but before she could step back, another hand shoved her forward, forcing her to her knees. Dust rose around her, clinging to her hair and her clothes, as if the ground itself had been stirred into witnessing her humiliation. They pressed the soil into her hands, demanding she lift it to her mouth. When she hesitated, a rough palm forced her jaw open and another voice roared, "Eat!" The crowd cheered as if they were at a feast, their voices a cruel thunder rolling above her. Her throat tightened and tears welled in her eyes, but she could not resist them. The handful of dirt was shoved into her mouth, dry, bitter, suffocating. She gagged, choking as grit scraped her tongue and clung to her throat. The crowd erupted in laughter at her sputtering, their delight swelling as her body shook with the effort to swallow. Her shame was greater than the taste of soil. Each laugh cut deeper than the grit in her teeth, each mocking cheer heavier than the dirt they forced upon her. They shoved another handful toward her lips, and when she turned her face away, hands grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. Strands tore painfully from her scalp, but still they pushed the earth to her mouth, smearing it across her face when she refused. Some clapped in rhythm, chanting, "Eat, eat, eat," like a song of cruelty, their voices pounding into her ears. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt, leaving muddy trails across her face. The soil stuck to her skin, clumped in her hair, lodged in the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg, but her voice was trapped beneath the weight of her humiliation. Her body trembled with each forced swallow, her chest heaving as if she might collapse under the cruelty. Yet through the choking, through the burning shame, she kept her spirit alive even if no one could see it. She endured because she had always endured. But the villagers only laughed louder. To them, her suffering was entertainment. They mocked her coughs, imitating her choking sounds as though it were a game. They pointed at her mouth, smeared with dirt, and shouted, "Look! The earth claims her at last." Children stomped their feet, adults clapped their hands, and the humiliation stretched on until time itself seemed twisted into torment. No one stepped forward to stop it, not even those who had once accepted her kindness. Fear of the crowd's wrath silenced them all, leaving her utterly alone in her shame. At last, when they had tired of their cruelty, they left her kneeling in the dirt, her body broken, her face streaked with mud and tears. Their laughter faded as they scattered, satisfied with the memory of her humiliation. She remained, hands pressed into the soil, chest shaking with quiet sobs. But beneath her tears, beneath her shame, something else stirred. The earth beneath her hands felt warmer than before, as if it were listening, as if it too had been forced to endure their mockery. She pressed her fingers deeper into the ground, her nails clawing at the soil that had been shoved into her mouth, and though her spirit trembled, her bond with the earth only grew stronger. The villagers thought they had broken her. They thought they had reduced her to nothing, made her less than human. But what they could not see was that the soil they mocked was not powerless. And though she wept in silence that night, the ground remembered everything. It began as a faint stirring, so subtle that no one else paid it any mind. The girl, however, felt it in her bones, as if the ground beneath her had begun breathing alongside her sorrow. She sat in the quiet of the night, her face streaked with dried tears and her body still heavy with humiliation, when she noticed at first a faint vibration in the soil beneath her palms. At first she thought it was her own trembling, the echo of pain still coursing through her. But as she stilled herself, she realized the earth moved even when she did not. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, a whisper traveling just beneath the surface. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the dirt as though listening for comfort. What she heard was not silence. There was a hum, low and deep, like 1,000 voices buried under the soil, murmuring secrets too ancient for her to understand. Her breath caught in her throat. She had always felt connected to the ground, walking barefoot through fields, tending to gardens, resting her cheek against the warm soil in moments of sadness. But this was different. This was the earth speaking back, reaching toward her as if it had finally decided to answer her unspoken prayers. At dawn, when she rose weakly to her feet, she saw something else. The roots of a nearby tree had shifted slightly, not in the way roots normally grew, but as if they had moved in the night with purpose. One root curled outward, wrapping around a stone as though clutching it. Another extended toward where she had slept, brushing against the hem of her garment like a hand reaching for hers. She gasped softly, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. But the villagers had already gone about their day, blind to the earth's subtle movements. Only she could see, only she could feel. Later, when she knelt by the river to wash the dirt from her hair and face, the water rippled strangely. The soil along the bank shifted beneath her fingers, patterns forming and dissolving as though something writhed just under the surface. She pulled back in alarm, her heart pounding, but the soil stilled the moment her touch left it. She tested again, pressing her palm into the wet ground, and there it was, the faint quiver like a sigh, like a presence acknowledging her. She whispered into the earth, "Are you listening?" And though no words came back, the soil's tremor seemed to answer. Days passed and the signs grew clearer. When she walked through the village paths, dust rose in faint spirals behind her, even when there was no wind. When she lay down at night, she could feel the ground shifting slightly beneath her body, cradling her as though it sought to comfort her bruised spirit. The whispers became louder in her dreams, not words but sounds, echoes of voices too deep and ancient to form into language. Sometimes she woke with the sensation that the earth had been moving around her as she slept, reshaping itself into unseen patterns. Her tormentors, blinded by arrogance, noticed nothing. They walked over the trembling ground and mocked her still, never realizing that the very soil they kicked up had begun to turn against them. She, however, could not ignore it. One evening, as she gathered herself on the edge of the fields, she saw stalks of grass bending in unnatural waves as if bowing to her. The roots at her feet curled toward her ankles, brushing against her skin like fingers caressing a beloved. The sensation both comforted and frightened her. She whispered again into the silence, "Why me?" And the earth's subtle sigh in response seemed to say, "Because you are mine." By now she could not deny it. The bond between her and the ground had changed. Where once the earth had been simply a home, it had become alive, listening, and restless. She had been humiliated, forced to eat the dirt they mocked, but in consuming it she had unknowingly drawn something deeper into herself. The soil was no longer something beneath her feet, it was something within her, something watching, something waiting. The first signs were small, invisible to all but her. Yet she knew they would not remain hidden forever. The whispers in the soil grew louder each night, and the tremors beneath her body stronger. Roots curled and shifted with a life of their own, waiting for the moment to rise. The earth, like her, had endured the mockery. And like her, it had begun to awaken. At first, she thought it was madness, the way her body responded whenever her fingers brushed against the soil. But the more time she spent away from the villagers, the more she realized it was real. Each morning, when the world was quiet and the fields lay untouched, she wandered barefoot across the earth, feeling the ground shift softly beneath her steps as if adjusting itself to cushion her. Sometimes she would kneel and press her palms into the soil, and the dirt would ripple outward in faint waves as though answering her touch. The sensation made her shiver, not out of fear but out of a strange comfort she had never known from people. Her whole life she had been overlooked, mocked for her simplicity, her humility. They saw her closeness to the land as lowly, even laughable. But now the very thing they scorned was giving her strength. One afternoon she crouched by a patch of barren ground where nothing had grown for seasons. She pressed her hands gently into it, whispering her pain into the soil as though it were a trusted friend. When she lifted her palms, small green shoots began to push through the surface, fragile yet determined. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared. The earth had listened, had answered. She smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes, and whispered, "You hear me." In the evenings when she lay down to rest, she no longer felt cold or abandoned. The earth cradled her body like a blanket, warm and alive, wrapping around her to shield her from the night chill. If she woke weeping from her dreams of humiliation, the soil seemed to rise slightly, pressing against her in reassurance, like the embrace of a mother. She would press her cheek to the ground and feel its steady thrum, as if its heartbeat aligned with hers. The bond grew stronger and so did her faith in it. Soon she began to experiment, though cautiously. When she dragged her fingers across the dirt, it followed, leaving lines as though invisible hands traced her movements beneath. When she planted her feet firmly and willed the soil to rise, dust stirred around her ankles and small stones shifted toward her. She learned to listen, not with her ears but with something deeper, a stillness in her chest that opened to the whispers and murmurs beneath the ground. The earth was not merely responding to her sorrow, it was offering her companionship, a power she had never imagined she possessed. What startled her most was the way her pain seemed to awaken the land. On days when she remembered too vividly the laughter of the villagers forcing dirt into her mouth, she would cry into the soil. In those moments, the ground quivered slightly, trembling as though it shared her fury. When she breathed deeply and calmed her heart, the earth stilled with her, settling back into quiet. It was as though they were bound together in an unspoken pact, her emotions guiding its movements, its strength feeding her own. This connection gave her peace she had never found among people. No cruel tongue mocked her here, no jealous kin tore at her spirit. The earth did not scorn her humility, it cherished it, magnified it. She began to feel beautiful in ways she had never dared believe. When she looked at her reflection in a pool after pressing her hands into the soil, her eyes gleamed differently, brighter, as if the ground had given her its fire. She touched her face, then touched the soil again and smiled at the way it shivered back to her, like an old friend sharing her joy. Night after night, she whispered her secrets into the dirt, her dreams, her pain, her longing for justice. And though no words ever came, she knew she was heard. Sometimes the wind carried a faint hum across the ground, sometimes roots stretched toward her resting place, sometimes the soil itself pulsed beneath her heartbeat. These small signs were enough. She was no longer alone. The bond was not only comfort, it was awakening. She realized that what they had forced her to eat in cruelty had become part of her, knitting her spirit to the land itself. Every grain of dirt they had shoved down her throat was now alive within her, connecting her to something vast, something eternal. And while the villagers still laughed in their ignorance, she knew the truth. The earth was her ally, her shield, her strength. Each day her power grew, subtle but undeniable. Each day the bond tightened, until she could no longer separate where her pain ended and where the earth's patience began. It was as if they were one. And deep inside, she knew that such a bond was not formed to be silent forever. The air in the village grew heavy in ways the people could not explain. At first, it was small things that went unnoticed by most, though she felt each one deep within her bones. When she walked past the trees, they seemed to groan, their branches swaying even when there was no wind. The ground beneath her feet felt alive, quivering faintly as though something ancient stirred beneath it. Stones cracked along pathways where none had stepped, their sharp sounds like teeth breaking in the silence of dusk. To her, these were no coincidences. The earth was no longer silent, it whispered back to her, carrying her sorrow and her anger through its hidden veins. Every tear she had shed into the soil seemed to have planted something intangible, something the villagers could not yet see but she could feel as a pulse under her palms. She began to notice how her emotions rippled outward into the land. When she wept quietly by herself, the soil darkened, drinking in her tears like seeds. When she clenched her fists in fear or shame, roots shifted beneath the ground, pushing upward as if trying to rise in her defense. The murmurs grew louder the longer she listened, low rumbles beneath the huts, the soft trembling of dust at her feet, the sigh of windless trees. It was as though the entire world around her was speaking, yet no one else cared to hear. Her heart, so long trampled by mockery, found strange solace in these voices, even though they came in unsettling tones. The villagers, however, began to notice fragments of the unease. At night, strange cracking sounds echoed from the fields. Sometimes, stones would split apart as if struck by invisible hammers, and roots burst through the paths, curling upward in crooked claw-like shapes. Animals grew restless. Goats bleated into the dark, chickens flapped wildly with no predator in sight, and dogs howled at nothing. The elders shook their heads, muttering about omens and unseen curses, but most of the villagers laughed it away. The earth is always restless, they said. It shifts, it breaks, it groans. Nothing more. But unease lingered beneath their denial, like a shadow that stretched further each night. Children whispered among themselves about the girl. They had seen her kneeling in the dirt, fingers buried in the soil as though she were praying not to the heavens but to the ground itself. Some swore they saw the grass bend toward her touch, or that the stones seemed to scatter aside when she walked. The adults hushed these stories quickly, dismissing them as childish nonsense. Still, whispers traveled and suspicion began to grow. A few mothers tugged their children away from her when she passed, muttering prayers under their breath. Yet they could not bring themselves to confront her, not openly, not when the air seemed to shiver faintly around her presence. At night, she lay awake listening to the murmurs grow stronger. The ground beneath her hut thrummed faintly, like the slow beat of a heart. She pressed her palms against the packed earth floor, and there it was again, the answering pulse, patient and steady, like an ancient being breathing beneath her. Sometimes she thought she could hear words in the low rumbles, though not in any human tongue. They were felt more than heard, vibrations that spread through her body like warmth. And in those moments she no longer felt alone. The earth was speaking for her, carrying the pain she had never been allowed to voice. The villagers tried to push away their fears by ridiculing her further. When stones split or trees cracked suddenly they mocked, "See what comes of a girl who eats dirt." Even the ground breaks with laughter at her shame. But their laughter rang hollow, for deep down, some part of them sensed that their cruelty was being remembered, not by her alone, but by the very soil they stood upon. The children heard it in their sleep, the rustle of roots pressing against the walls of their huts, the shifting of stones near their beds. Farmers saw it in their fields when crops bent unnaturally, as though bowing to something unseen. Yet still they clung to their dismissal. "Superstition," they muttered. "The land is fickle. This is nothing new." But even as they spoke, their voices carried unease, their eyes darting to the cracked stones, the twisted roots, the restless trees. And the girl, quiet and watchful, began to understand the truth the others refused to see. The earth was no longer indifferent. It had awakened with her sorrow. It had begun to carry her anger. And it was only a matter of time before its murmurs grew into something they could no longer ignore. It began slowly, the change in the land, but soon there was no denying it. The girl had carried her rage quietly for so long that even she had not realized how deep it had been buried. But rage, like a seed, does not die when forced underground. It waits, it roots, it spreads, and when the time comes, it rises with a strength that cannot be contained. Now, as she moved through the village, the earth seemed to breathe with her anger. When her chest tightened with bitterness, the ground groaned. When her fists clenched with unspoken fury, cracks spread across the soil. When her eyes welled with tears she refused to shed, the winds howled through the huts, scattering dust and leaves in violent spirals. The villagers began to notice in ways they could no longer laugh away. A sudden tremor would rattle pots from their shelves. The earth split beneath their feet as they walked, thin cracks racing through the paths like black veins. Sometimes a hut would shake without warning, its walls creaking as though the ground beneath it sought to swallow it whole. The farmers in the fields grew fearful as their hoes struck not firm soil, but earth that trembled as though alive. Crops that once bent gently with the wind now twisted and shook as if fighting unseen hands. At night, the winds became restless. They screamed through the village with the fury of 1,000 unseen spirits, tearing at thatched roofs, slamming open shutters, and scattering embers from hearths. Children cried in their mothers' arms, unable to sleep for the shaking earth and the wailing air. The elders muttered prayers, tossing herbs into the fire, but no ritual calmed the storm that seemed to grow worse with each passing night. The girl, however, felt no fear. She sat quietly in the midst of it all, her hands pressed into the soil, her heart pounding in rhythm with the earth's shifting heartbeat. She knew this was not the world turning against her, it was the world rising with her. Every insult, every cruel laugh, every handful of dirt shoved into her mouth was remembered by the land itself. Her rage had taken root in the ground, and now it was spreading outward like fire hidden beneath ash, waiting for the wind to fan it. The villagers whispered more openly now. "She is cursed," some said. "She brings the wrath of the earth with her." Others grew bold in their fear, declaring, "This is punishment upon us all for letting her walk among us. She must be cast out." But even as they spoke of banishing her, none dared to act. For whenever they raised their voices against her, the ground beneath them shuddered as though warning them to hold their tongues. A man who once spat at her door found his hut collapsing into a sudden fissure the next day, his family barely escaping the rubble. Another who mocked her in the market stumbled into a crack that opened under his feet, spraining his leg so badly he could no longer walk without a limp. Coincidence, some tried to argue, but the tremor seemed too precise, too sharp, too timely to be chance. The more they tried to deny it, the more violent the land became. Stones rolled down from the hills at odd hours, crushing fences and scattering goats. Wells caved in, leaving only yawning holes where water once flowed. The villagers' songs of harvest were replaced with prayers for safety, their laughter smothered by the ever-present groan of the restless earth. And through it all, the girl walked calmly, her steps steady even when the ground shook, her figure unbending even as trees cracked and winds screamed. Her buried rage was no longer buried, it was rising, spilling into every corner of the village. The land itself seemed to share her memory of humiliation, and it carried that memory with a vengeance. The villagers, once bold in their cruelty, now walked with fear in their eyes, careful where they placed their feet, careful not to speak too loudly against her. But fear did not bring them humility, it brought them bitterness. Some plotted in secret, whispering that she must be silenced before the earth tore the village apart. Others, trembling, wondered if it was too late, that the ground they lived on had already chosen whose side it was on. And still the cracks widened. The winds grew wilder. The earth groaned louder. It was no longer the faint murmurs of unease, it was the rising cry of anger, an anger that matched the one she had been forced to swallow for so long. Now both she and the land were no longer silent. They were awake, restless, and vengeful. And the villagers, whether they admitted it or not, knew that they had stirred something far greater than a girl's wounded pride. They had stirred the fury of the earth itself. The day came when the ground no longer merely trembled but rose in open defiance of those who had wronged her. It began quietly, with a low rumble underfoot as though the earth itself were breathing, drawing in a long deep breath. The villagers froze in their tasks, their ears straining to understand the sound. Then, without warning, the soil surged upward, lifting in great walls of mud that slithered into place like living creatures. Paths were blocked, homes hemmed in by barriers of clay and dust that thickened with every heartbeat. The village, once so sure of its dominance over the humble girl, now found itself a prisoner of the very ground it stood upon. Roots that once lay quietly buried beneath the soil began to writhe and twist, breaking free in violent bursts. They slithered across the earth like serpents, coiling around legs and dragging men to the ground. Women screamed as the roots wrapped around their huts, pulling them tighter until the wooden beams cracked and splintered. Goats and chickens scattered in panic, their hooves and claws slipping in the rising mud, while dust filled the air in choking clouds. The villagers coughed and stumbled, their eyes burning, their bodies pressed by the suffocating weight of the land itself. Those who had laughed the loudest at her humiliation were the first to feel the soil's vengeance. One man tried to run, but his feet sank ankle-deep into the mud, as though the ground itself had grown greedy for him. He clawed and kicked, but with every desperate movement, the earth pulled him deeper, until only his screams echoed above the choking dust. Another woman, who once jeered as the girl was forced to eat dirt, found herself struck by a wall of mud that rose suddenly before her. It pressed her back with suffocating force, plastering her in filth, forcing her mouth open until soil filled her throat just as it had once filled the girl's. The dust grew so thick that the sky seemed to vanish, turning day into a choking twilight. The villagers stumbled blindly, their eyes stinging, their throats raw, while the girl stood untouched in the center of it all. Around her, the soil shifted and moved, yet not a grain clung to her skin. She stood as if shielded by an unseen force, her presence calm even as chaos raged. The villagers saw her through the storm of earth and dust, her figure like a dark omen, and in that moment they knew, she had become one with the land. The roots moved with purpose, striking at those who had inflicted cruelty. They tore through woven fences, snatched cooking pots, and overturned baskets of grain as if mocking the villagers' sense of order. Walls of mud shifted to herd people like cattle, driving them into corners, isolating them, surrounding them with earth that grew higher and heavier. No matter where they ran, the soil rose up to meet them, closing every path of escape. Panic turned to hysteria. Some clawed at the mud walls with bare hands, their fingernails breaking and bleeding as the earth swallowed their efforts. Others fell to their knees, begging for forgiveness, crying out prayers to ancestors who did not answer. But the soil did not relent. It moved with memory, knowing who had mocked, who had spat, who had pushed dirt into the girl's mouth. Its vengeance was exact, precise, and merciless. Through the dust and shifting earth, the girl's eyes glowed with something no longer human, calm yet infinite. She did not speak, yet her silence was louder than any curse. The land itself became her voice, delivering the justice she had been denied. The villagers realized too late that in forcing her to eat dirt, they had bound her to the very element that now rose against them. What they had used to humiliate her had become her weapon, her shield, her army. The ground shook once more harder than before, and entire huts collapsed into heaps of wood and straw. Roots tore through walls like knives, dust storms blinded and choked, and mud walls shifted higher, sealing the fate of all who had scorned her. The village was no longer theirs, it belonged to the soil and the soil belonged to her. And still she stood untouched, her feet planted firmly on the trembling earth, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She did not command with words, for she did not need to. The earth knew her rage, her pain, her truth, and it rose to protect her, to avenge her, to remind the cruel that the soil they mocked was alive, and it remembered. The air grew heavier than ever, the kind of suffocating weight that pressed against lungs and made each breath feel stolen. The earth, restless and alive, rumbled with a hunger that had been building since the moment the girl's lips were forced into the soil. The villagers staggered across the trembling ground, their cries filling the night, but there was no escape. The soil beneath their feet had chosen its justice, and it would not relent. It began with a sudden crack, sharp and violent, splitting the earth in two. The sound echoed through the village like thunder, and the ground beneath the mockers buckled. They screamed as the soil shifted, splitting wide into black mouths that yawned beneath their feet. Men who had laughed as the girl ate dirt stumbled forward, arms flailing, their bodies swallowed waist-deep in churning mud. They clawed at the ground, at each other, at anything solid, but their fingers scraped only loose earth that crumbled away as they sank deeper. The women who had jeered the loudest were dragged toward the opening cracks by roots that lashed like living whips. Their ankles were caught, their legs yanked backward into the collapsing ground. They screamed her name, begged for mercy, but the girl only stood in silence, her gaze steady, her presence calm amidst their chaos. Her silence was the answer. The earth would speak for her. One man, the one who first shoved dirt into her mouth, tried to scramble onto higher ground, clutching at a wooden post. But the post itself shuddered and fell as the soil beneath it collapsed, pulling him down with it. His body twisted, his nails shredded as he dragged them across the dirt, but every inch he gained was stolen back as the ground shifted under him. With a final scream, he was gone, his voice muffled beneath the soil. The earth's hunger grew. Cracks spidered outward, ripping through huts, splitting paths, devouring fences and fields alike. The livestock fled in a frenzy, but even they could not escape. Goats were swallowed, chickens vanished beneath collapsing coops, their cries joining the terrified shouts of villagers. Dust clouds rose thick, blinding, as though the land itself wished to erase all evidence of what once stood there. Those who once mocked stood no chance. Their faces twisted with terror as the ground beneath them quaked, buckling in waves that threw them off balance. Mothers clutched children who had not taken part in the cruelty, praying desperately for mercy. And strangely, the ground stilled beneath those innocents, leaving them untouched while their tormentor parents sank screaming into the earth. It was as if the soil itself carried memory, punishing only those whose laughter had been cruel, whose hands had shoved, whose hearts had scorned. The cries of the guilty grew shrill, shrieks that pierced the night but ended suddenly as the earth closed over them. Their hands, reaching upward in final desperation, were swallowed last, fingers grasping at the air, at the sky, at anything that might save them, before being dragged into darkness. The ground shuddered one last time, sealing its cracks, leaving only uneven soil where dozens had once stood. The silence afterward was unbearable. The only sound was the soft groan of shifting roots and the faint crumble of dirt settling back into place. The village was broken, streets torn, homes destroyed, families shattered, but the cruelest voices were gone, erased from the world. At the center of it all stood the girl, untouched, her bare feet steady upon the soil that had avenged her. Her hair stirred in the breeze, her face calm but unreadable. She had not lifted a hand, had not uttered a word, yet the land had moved mountains for her. Those who survived, innocents and trembling bystanders, watched her in awe and fear. They no longer saw a weak girl mocked for her humility. They saw the earth's chosen, its living voice, the vessel of its vengeance. The night sky above remained clear, the stars bright and cold as though they bore witness. Beneath them, the villagers whispered in dread, too afraid to speak too loudly, fearing the earth might hear and mistake their words for mockery. They knew the truth now. When they forced her to eat dirt, they had bound her to the soil, and the soil had claimed them in return. And as the last screams of the guilty faded into the depths, the village was left with only silence, broken huts, trembling survivors, and the haunting knowledge that the ground beneath their feet was no longer lifeless. It was awake, remembered. It could swallow again. The night after the earth swallowed the cruel ones, the village sat in a silence so deep it felt as though the soil itself was listening. Survivors huddled together, their eyes darting to the ground with every faint rumble, terrified that the earth might open again. Where laughter had once echoed, mockery, taunts, and cruel delight, now there was only trembling quiet. No one dared speak her name above a whisper, for they feared the earth might hear and rise again in her defense. The girl who had been forced to kneel in the dirt and eat it, now stood apart from them all, a figure that no one dared approach. When she walked through the ruined streets, people moved out of her path. Mothers pulled their children close, warning them with sharp whispers not to stare, not to point, not even to breathe too loudly. Men who had once laughed at her shame now dropped their gaze, as if meeting her eyes might summon the ground to open beneath them. Even the animals treated her differently. Dogs did not bark, goats bowed their heads, and birds circled quietly overhead, refusing to land near her. It was as though all of nature recognized her as something beyond human, something the world itself had chosen to protect. Every broken home and every fresh mound of earth reminded the villagers of the night's horrors. They could still hear faint echoes of the screams carried on the wind, or so they believed. Children asked if the missing had gone to the underworld, but the elders shook their heads and muttered that no god had claimed them. It was the earth itself that had taken them. Whispers spread quickly. She is the daughter of the soil, some said. The ground obeys her, others murmured. A few dared to whisper the most chilling thought of all, that she no longer belonged to them but to the earth's wrath. She did not smile, nor did she weep. She carried herself with calmness, her feet bare against the soil, her palms pressing gently against the ground as if feeling its heartbeat. When she passed by the gate where she had been humiliated, villagers bowed their heads. No one dared repair the splintered wood or clean the churned earth. It became a shrine of sorts, a reminder of what cruelty had cost them. To walk near it was to risk trembling knees and a racing heart, for the whisper said the soil there still shifted at night as though hungry for more. The villagers' fear grew into rituals. Some began to leave offerings of grain and water at the edges of the fields, hoping to appease the earth that had once been their friend but had now shown its power. Others avoided farming the land at all, claiming the soil was cursed. Crops were left to wither not because the land failed them but because the people no longer trusted it. Each crack in the ground, each falling stone, each rustling root was seen as a sign that the earth was still watching, still remembering. Yet amidst the terror there was awe. Some whispered that she was chosen, that the soil had not cursed the village but had finally revealed its true loyalty. The girl once mocked as weak, was untouchable now. No one dared raise a hand against her. No one dared speak ill of her. Where cruelty had once isolated her, fear now surrounded her like an unbreakable wall. At night, when the wind blew across the village, people claimed to hear low murmurs in the ground, voices rumbling like thunder beneath their homes. They said it was the earth speaking in her name, warning them never to forget. Even in their dreams, villagers saw her figure, the girl standing silently, her hands resting on the soil, her eyes watching, her presence steady and eternal. The once proud village, filled with arrogance and laughter, was reduced to a place of whispers and trembling footsteps. No one forgot the way the earth had swallowed its chosen victims, and no one forgot that it had done so for her. The girl had become untouchable, a living legend within her own lifetime. She no longer needed to speak, the earth itself spoke for her. And the survivors knew with chilling certainty that if they dared mock her again, or mock anyone who bore her innocence, the soil beneath their feet would remember and it would rise. Generations passed, yet the memory of that girl never faded. She was no longer spoken of by name. Instead, she was called the Earth's Daughter, a title both reverent and fearful. Elders told the story in hushed tones by the fireside, their voices trembling as they recalled the night the ground rose up to avenge her humiliation. Children leaned in close, wide-eyed and silent, as they heard of the cruelty that had once forced a girl to eat dirt, only for the soil to turn against her tormentors. The lesson was always clear. The earth remembers and it protects its own. Travelers who came through the region were warned not to laugh at the innocent or scorn the humble, for those who did often found themselves stumbling on uneven ground, tripping over roots that had not been there moments before, or hearing the groan of the earth beneath their feet. In storms, lightning struck fields where arrogance had been sown, and rain carved deep furrows near the homes of the unkind. Villagers swore it was the earth's daughter reminding them that cruelty did not vanish. It sank into the ground and waited to rise again. The place where she had been mocked, the old gate splintered by time, was never rebuilt. Instead, it stood as a sacred ruin, overgrown with vines and shaded by trees that twisted their roots protectively around the earth below. Women placed small offerings there, baskets of grain, gourds of water, and garlands of flowers. They whispered prayers for mercy, asking the earth to shelter their children and to forgive the sins of their kin. Men walked past quickly, avoiding looking at the place, muttering quiet chants as though to keep the soil from stirring beneath their steps. Legends told that on nights when the moon was hidden, a figure could be seen standing near the gate, A young woman with her feet bare, her hands pressed against the ground, her gaze unblinking. Her presence was said to bring chills to the air and silence to the animals. Some claimed her eyes glowed faintly like embers buried in ash. Others swore they saw the ground ripple beneath her, as though breathing with her spirit. To see her, people said, was both a blessing and a curse. Blessing if one lived with kindness, curse if one carried cruelty in their heart. The tale spread beyond the village. Neighboring clans passed it along, each adding their own detail, but the core remained the same. Mock the innocent and the earth itself will remember. Parents used the story to quiet quarrels among their children, warning that a cruel word spoken in jest could take root in the soil and sprout into vengeance years later. Farmers poured libations into the dirt before planting, whispering thanks to the earth's daughter for reminding them to respect the land that sustained them. Even hunters, before striking their prey, touched the ground and asked forgiveness, for fear that one day the soil would rise to punish unnecessary cruelty. And so, over time, the girl who had been humiliated became more than human. She was remembered as a guardian spirit, an unseen presence beneath every field, every forest, every path trodden by human feet. Her suffering became her crown, her humility her strength, and her shame transformed into a warning etched in every heartbeat of the land. Those who mocked her were buried, but her story lived on, carried in whispers, in prayers, and in trembling respect. The people never forgot. Even centuries later, when storms shook the earth or tremors split the ground, they would murmur, "The earth's daughter is watching." And with that reminder they lived more gently, more humbly, knowing that cruelty once sown does not disappear. It sinks deep into the soil, waiting to rise when least expected.